across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It's the Thursday edition of Point of View. Next hour, we're going to be getting into some of the things happening, for example, in China, as President Donald Trump is meeting with Xi Jinping, along with a number of individuals on both sides of both China and the United States. We'll get into that. Some more to talk about this issue of socialism and capitalism, which, by the way, will surface in this conversation we're going to have in just a minute, but we will get into that in more details next hour. But we are privileged to bring back to the microphone George Barna. As you well know, a while back we've had some conversations and even did an outlook on the subject of rumblings of revival. Now, we called it that because I think sometimes people have overplayed the idea that Gen Z has shown a more significant interest spiritually. There are some good news and a fair amount of bad news, but nevertheless, we thought it would be very helpful for you to know a little bit more about the spiritual progress and regress of Gen Z. George Barna, again, is a professor at Arizona Christian University, director of research at the Cultural Research Center. Individual also has served as the senior research fellow at the Family Research Council and was the founder of the Barna Group. And George Barna, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, always good to be with you.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about good news, bad news, because in your recent report, and we've posted it there, of course, you can go to, again, the Arizona Christian University website. We have that linked as well. Is Gen Z the youngest adult generation in America experiencing revival? And the answer, you say, is complicated. Let's maybe focus on a few of the positives, because you do have some places where we are seeing a significant uptick. And let's start with the positive. What are those?
Well, of course, Kerby, when we look at worldview, you've got to look at both behavior and beliefs. And so as we do that, we did find one belief where there was a significant improvement over the last 6 years. Again, 6 years ago, these people were teenagers. So we have the data from when they were teenagers. Now we look at them as young adults. What we find is that in terms of beliefs, there was a 10 percentage point increase in the number of them who believed that they were created by God. They were made in His likeness, and that they've been undermined by sin and therefore need to be saved. At this point, about half of that group of young adults who are now roughly 18 to 23, it's the older portion of Gen Z. It's not the entire Gen Z, but the older end of it, it's gone from 40% who believe that God made them in His likeness and they struggle with sin, from 40% up to 50%. And then there are some behaviors as well, where we find that the percentage of them who say that they're deeply committed to practicing their religious faith, not necessarily Christianity, but whatever they believe their religious faith is, that's risen by 17 points. So that's a positive, because if nothing else, it means they're trying, they're searching, they're experimenting. We find that there's also growth in the number of them who say that they're likely to rely on the Bible.
Yes.
When they have to make moral decisions. That went up 9 percentage points. And then we saw smaller rises in terms of those who call themselves Christian and those who say they read the Bible weekly. One of the more interesting things to me was that we did see a softening of resistance to some other behaviors that practicing Christians would engage in. Things like seeking to know and do God's will every day, or acknowledging the fact that they're a sinner, confessing those sins, asking God's forgiveness every day, or things like intentionally making time to thank and praise and worship God daily. Now, most Gen Zers, the adult portion of it, do not do those things every day. There was a much larger proportion who said they would never do that. But the survey showed that over the last 6 years, there's been a softening to the resistance to doing that. And so many of them have now moved to, well, I'll do that once in a while. So it's not everything we want it to be, but it's positive.
And again, you can kind of put these in a category. I would encourage people to get your report, of course, sign up for the things that you produce there through the very significant Cultural Research Center, because you have like 7 that are positive, 7 that are negative. And before we get to the negatives, let's talk about at least 1 or 2 of those positives in terms of increase of 10% in weekly Bible reading, increase of 9% of relying primarily on the Bible for moral guidance. One of the things we're seeing, George, is that the sales of Bibles to people who are making a first-time purchase of the Bible have gone up significantly, and the interest in the U-Bible and other online Bibles seems to indicate at least something that is moving in a very positive direction in terms of rooting your life in terms of biblical principles. What do you think?
Well, maybe I'm not quite as sanguine as you are about that, because I know that one of the things I've found over the 40-plus years of doing research is that if behavior happens before the belief supporting that behavior
Good point.
changes, then you've got a problem, because what you wind up with are empty routines
Right.
that are not fulfilling to the individual. And that has a lasting negative effect spiritually from a Christian vantage point. We know from past research that those people who have gone through that, where they've gone to church, they've read the Bible, they attended the events, but they hadn't had the discussions and the education previously as to, well, what does it mean to worship God? Why would you go worship God? How can you trust the Bible? Why should you read it regularly? What do you do with those things that it's teaching you? If you haven't had that kind of rootedness, that grounding, that foundation that's been poured before you start engaging in the activities, you stop doing the activities because they're not fulfilling. Why? Because you didn't understand them. They didn't have any point. And long term, when somebody may come up to you later on in that person's life, trying to engage them in authentic Christianity, they put their hand up and say, no, stop right there. I've already done the Christian thing.
Yeah.
It didn't work for me. So we got to be really careful that we don't jump ahead of ourselves here. And that's one of the things that we see coming out of this study, is that there's a lot more behavioral change than there is belief change.
And let's see if we can. We need to take a break, so we'll come back and talk about that behavioral one. But just before we take a break, a lot of that gets back to what we talk about every day here on Point of View, and that is this idea of worldview. If indeed you have a stirring of the heart or even a desire to get into the Bible, but you don't really believe the Bible is the Word of God, or you don't believe that it should be the foundation for the decisions you're making, or if on some of the standard 7 worldview measures you don't necessarily agree with, of course, what would be an orthodox view, that's going to be a problem. So when we come back, we're going to talk about some of these negative shifts. Some of those are shifts in worldview, some of them shifts in the area of behavior. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about this, again, I think this is accurately titled Examining the Recent Spiritual Progress and Regress of Gen Z. So we're going to come back and talk about some of those negative issues, and then, of course, illustrate why it would be so important for you in the church to identify these issues and to begin to think about more about how to counter program to some of these ideas. So again, George Barna with us. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, we have a link to the Cultural Research Center. I would encourage you to sign up to get their newsletter, their printouts, but also we have this particular article on examining the recent spiritual progress and regress of Gen Z. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been talking about a financial realignment of the global financial system, which he calls Bretton Woods 2.0, but should probably be described as Bretton Woods 3.0. Here are the 3 eras of the U.S. economy. Bretton Woods is the agreement established in 1944. The U.S. dollar became the reserve currency, and the agreement also created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The dollar was pegged to gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. That lasted until 1971, when Richard Nixon closed the gold window. Bretton Woods 2.0 was never officially negotiated but emerged because of an agreement with Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars and recycle the proceeds into U.S. treasuries. This was the era of the petrodollar and lasted about 50 years. But now we see many countries selling oil in Chinese yuan and other currencies. Bretton Woods 1.0 was the dollar on gold. Bretton Woods 2.0 was the dollar on oil. Bretton Woods 3.0 is the dollar on stablecoins. People in other countries with unstable currencies would like to have their finances in dollars rather than their local fiat currency. Stablecoins are backed by U.S. Treasuries, which helps the government fund its national debt. With that as background, perhaps you can see why Congress already passed the Genius Act, which regulates stablecoins, and why the Senate now seems poised to pass the Clarity Act, which provides a regulatory framework for stablecoins and other digital assets. I believe we are moving into a new era of finance, which the administration believes will help us to continue to fund the growing national debt. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with George Barna. Let me again encourage you to get a copy of this particular aspect of the American Worldview Inventory, this one on recent spiritual progress and regress of Gen Z. It is something you might want to actually teach. I was in a board meeting the other day where Steve Cable took a summary of all this and educated our board members. That is something you might want to do for your Sunday school teachers or your deacons or elders or others. And I think now, if we could, let's talk about the negative. You've got two categories there. First of all, negative changes. 6 of the 7 negative changes are moving away from biblical thinking. And then in some of the others, I guess there were like 9, no change. So we've given what little good news, but now, if you can, tell us some of the bad news.
Well, when we look at these things, I mean, they're very important because, again, you do what you believe. And so if your beliefs are wrong, biblically speaking, your behavior is going to be errant as well. And so what we see here is a young generation of adults moving farther from biblical truth. For instance, we saw an 18 percentage point decline in the proportion of people from this group who say that the marriage of one man to one woman is God's only plan for humanity across all cultures.
Yes.
That's the way God sees it. Well, that's not the way Gen Z is seeing it. They're moving farther away from that. Their perspective is, you know what, marriage isn't necessary. It's a personal choice. How you get married, who you get married to, whether you choose to stay married, whether you choose to have children, all of those are personal choices. And whatever choice you make, it's yours. There's no morally superior choice to be found anywhere. So that's the mindset that they're shifting toward. In addition to that, we saw that there was almost as big a decline in the proportion who say capitalism is preferred over socialism. There was a 17-point rise in the number of Gen Z adults who say that they prefer socialism over capitalism.
Right.
Then you move through. You've got a 15-point increase in the proportion of them who say that Jesus was both human and divine on earth, but because he was human, he sinned when he was on earth.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of changes your whole perspective about the
does.
Lord. Yeah. Then we saw a 13-point increase in the number of them who say that they're consistently receiving helpful guidance from their horoscope. And one of the things here that indicates, again, this is a period of experimentation for this group. And so this is one of the things they're experimenting with. Nothing is out of bounds for them. They don't necessarily believe in the Bible. They'll look at it. They'll see if it has something useful, but then they'll turn to their horoscope, then they'll go to crystals, then they'll go to whatever else is on the horizon for them. We found that there was a continued rise in the number of Gen Zers who say there is no such thing as absolute moral truth. Every individual has to determine truth for him or herself. We had a 9-point increase in the number who say, you know what, we're never going to know how the universe got here. So kind of a rejection of the creation argument. And then you've got a 6-point rise in the proportion of them who say, after you die, it's just over. Nothing happens. There's no afterlife experience whatsoever. Heaven, hell, reincarnation, none of that. Now, reincarnation is a big deal to this particular generation. But the biggest growth that we saw in the last 6 years was in those who say, nah, you simply return to dust.
Just incredible. Let me just hold up the booklets that we've done on both capitalism and socialism, and then one specifically on socialism. We even have one that we did on the road to serfdom. And George, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But as you point out, it does seem to me that as we are seeing democratic socialists being elected in New York City, in Seattle, we have members of Congress that call themselves socialists. That role model seems to have had a very positive impact. And just as we have been warning for years that once you legalize same-sex marriage, the next generation is going to say, well, it probably doesn't matter whether you marry somebody of the same sex or the opposite sex. Now, because you have so many more visible people that call themselves socialists, you can explain, in a sense, both of those factors. And these are all remarkably strong and concerning negative shifts away from biblical orthodoxy, aren't they?
Certainly is, Kerby. And you know, the problem is when you open the door to sin and you live in a culture that believes that experimentation is not only possible, but it's the smart move because there's no absolute moral truth. You're the one who has to determine how everything is going to work in your life. You're the one who determines whether or not your life is a success, as opposed to biblical thinking about success as consistent obedience to God. That's not the way that our culture sees it. So when we open these doors, whether it's to socialism or abortion or gay marriage or whatever it may be, people are going to go through that door and experiment, and that's a dangerous time.
One other thing I thought I'd just mention near the end, you, of course, asked the question, is the United States experiencing a time of revival now among the youngest adults? And I love your answer. The research gives a lukewarm affirmation of revival at best. And on this program, we've talked about what has been happening in some of the college campuses, and that's encouraging. But nevertheless, what you would hope is that it would not just be an emotional experience, but that we would not only be having a revival of our hearts, but a reformation of our minds. And that really brings us back to the kind of work that you've been doing all these years, George Barna, in terms of not only these surveys, but the books that you have written and some of the other resources, which tell me once again that if you were in front of pastors right now, you'd just begin telling them, once again, we need to come back to the basics. We need to teach biblical worldview. We need to begin to talk about, indeed, how the Bible relates to every area of life. And that, in some respects, gives us the opportunity to see maybe an occasional spark of revival. But if this is going to be a full-fledged revival or even a reformation, we still have a lot more work to do, don't we?
We sure do. I mean, I don't want to lose sight of the fact this is exciting that we've got a younger generation coming into their adult years who are open to possibilities, and that Christianity, for many of them, is one of those possibilities that they're open to. But the fact that they explore, the fact that they're searching is not the same as revival. And you're exactly right. I mean, so much of the research that I've done shows it all depends on what foundation you've built. You've got to build it early with children. If you don't build it with them, then when they get to be adults, you've got twice the work to do, because you got to jackhammer out that existing foundation,
Yes.
and then you've got to pour in a godly foundation. So it's a lot easier to get it right first. But if we don't, the game isn't over. But we just have to be committed to the fact that this is going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of energy. It's not a 6-month program. It's not a 4-week sermon series. This is something where we're talking about come alongside them, build a relationship, get their trust, have Socratic conversations with them, model for them the very kinds of outcomes you're talking about. And so it's going to take time, but we've got to put the time in.
Let me just mention again, we have a link to the Cultural Research Center, and I would encourage you to go there because you can see the research that they are producing. You can even click on that button there that has the latest research, or just scroll down, and we actually have in a PDF format of this issue of examining the recent spiritual progress and regress of Gen Z. It's about 10 pages. I would encourage you to print it out. Make sure you have 10 pages of blank paper in your printer, and then begin to pass it around and talk about it. Like I said, I was in an event the other day where we actually had someone take a summary of this and presented it to us, and I would encourage you to do the very same. So, George Barna, as always, I appreciate the fact that you have become the gold standard in looking at these statistical issues, and I would certainly want to say that people should take advantage of those resources that you've made available. And as always, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for the chance to share it, Kerby. I appreciate it. Keep doing what you're doing.
Going to take a break, and we, again, encourage you to find some of these resources because those are very key. Now, in just a minute, Barry Meguiar is going to be with us. We'll talk about Ignite America. And, of course, one solution is obviously to lead people to the Lord. One solution is to spread the good news and to actually be involved in evangelism. And so he will certainly be talking about that. We have a link to his igniteamerica.com website. His podcast, we'll talk about some of the other resources that he has made available over the years. But if you're concerned about the direction of America, then I think that we certainly have to pay attention to what's in the hearts and minds, even of young people, Generation Y, the millennial generation, Generation Z, that are in our churches, or even those that are outside the churches, which we could attract to our churches and begin to disciple them. These are key issues. But when we come back, we're also going to talk about the need to reach out to those who have never committed to Jesus Christ. What can we do to reach out to our friends, neighbors, and coworkers? We'll talk about that with Barry Meguiar right after these important messages.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. I might just mention tomorrow we're going to spend some time talking about Rededicate 250, which of course is going to happen over the weekend, even the time in which the president has actually called for a national Shabbat or Sabbath. And so we'll be talking about what happens in the future. Of course, we've just been talking with George Barna about, do we have evidence of spiritual progress a little bit, but also a spiritual regress with Gen Z? And that is certainly the case. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that individuals have accepted Jesus Christ. And so I thought it would be appropriate for you to hear a little bit more from an individual that will certainly encourage you to be more bold in sharing your faith, and that's Barry Meguiar. You know him perhaps as the founder of an organization that provided the #1 car wax in America and really around the world. Also, for about 18 years, had the Car Crazy TV show, but an individual that has really wanted to reach out and do kingdom work. He sat on ministry boards for not only his home church, but for Vanguard University and David Wilkerson's World Challenge and others. We have a link to igniteamerica.com. You can find out more about his ministry, his website, the podcast, his Bible study, and much, much more. So, Barry, welcome to Point of View.
Wow. Yeah, we've run out of time. It's been nice talking with you. Too much time on me and not enough on you and what you're doing. And I got to tell you, being on Point of View with Kerby Anderson doesn't get any better than this. So I'm having a good day.
Well, I'm glad you are, because we want you to maybe talk about, we did with George Barna, talk about the negative, and let's talk about this, because we've talked about whether or not we should be involved in evangelism. It's kind of optional, and as a result, we have fewer and fewer people going to church. I did a commentary recently where even the statistics saying this many people, or this percentage of people went to church, probably are inflated. And so if we're concerned about the direction of this country, and we want to have a time to pray for America, it does seem to me that the first step is to be involved in the kinds of resources that you've been making available for years and really help people to ignite their faith. So tell us more, if you might.
Well, the church, I think we're the problem. The world's not the problem. They're lost, and for the last 60 years, we've stopped talking to them about the Lord. How are they going to know unless somebody tells them? Nobody's telling them. And who's going to tell them unless they're being sent? Churches, pastors, you're not sending us. Only 10% of our sermons, according to Barna. And I love his statistics, but only 10% of our sermons anymore are, and that's even backed up by Pew Research with 50,000 sermons, a big, huge study. Only 10% even talk about salvation. I mean, it's just incredible, leave alone sending us out. But it is the Great Commission. We're all called. On our website, igniteamerica.com, we have most frequent excuses.
Yes.
I don't know enough. I haven't been trained. I don't have the person. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
There's no excuses, folks. He didn't say, "Go ye who are trained or gifted, or can quote scriptures or anything." He just said, "Go." And by the way, he didn't say you have to do anything else. He just said, "Go." And guess what? You don't have to prepare. Do you know that sharing your faith is fun? It's like the most fun thing you can do when you just love on people. He says they'll know you're my disciple by your love. Well, you can do that, folks. Those of you listen, I was an introvert when I started doing this. Believe me, I had nothing going for me in learning this the easy way, because it was easy. Once you start loving on people open up. They're not offended. They don't get mad at you when you tell them God loves you. The world is starving. 90% of the people that we walk by every day are lost. They're lost, and they're not evil. They may look evil. They're not evil. They're lost. They literally see good as evil, and evil as good. That explains all the craziness today. Why is that? Because they've never seen the light, because we're not sharing the light. So we're out of time, and we have to get off the bench and into the game. And when we do that, it ignites your life. In fact, I wrote a book on it, Ignite Your Life. This is the way you do it, because when you just love on people, and then the Holy Spirit speaks through you and gives you the words, and the person in front of you is changing in the span of 5 minutes of a conversation in the aisle at Starbucks, you realize God is using you there at that moment, and stop worrying about getting them saved at that moment. Sometimes that happens, but we say always, always, always move everybody. For when you're with your spouse in the morning or whoever, but move everybody every day closer to Jesus. And when you do that, you're praying without ceasing. You're in the Word. Your whole life comes alive. And so I'll give you this great scripture real quick if you don't remember any of the scripture, remember this one. Go to Isaiah 43:10. And he explains that sharing your faith is not about them. It's secondarily about them. It's about you, about your faith, to get beyond your fear. If you're living in fear, this is how you get out of fear. He says, in Isaiah 43:10, I appoint you as my witness so that you will believe.
And again, let me just mention that you mentioned your book, Ignite Your Life, Defeat Fear with Effortless Faith. And I might mention that book. Faith. Yeah, Effortless Faith. And again, Ignite Your Life is the book. Also, you have the Ignite Your Life Bible study. So one of the things I want people to know is they can simply go to your website, igniteamerica.com. We have the link up there. If they scroll down, there's a whole section there for why, how, and tools, but most importantly, all sorts of resources. And a minute ago, you just said something about, am I not prepared? Whenever we are encouraging people to maybe go to even a short-term missions outreach, Barry, we oftentimes make the statement that if you've been listening to Point of View or you've been in church for a while, you're better prepared than most of the people that you're going to be talking to in another country, right?
Oh, it's so true. And one of the great fears, though, I can't answer a question. The question they answer, they have so little knowledge, folks.
Yes.
That their questions are easily answered. But better than that, the Holy Spirit will give you the words to say when you don't know the words to say. So you have total backup. You have the Holy Spirit backing you up. And there's nothing better than when you're talking to somebody, all of a sudden a scripture comes out of your mouth you haven't heard for 10 years.
Yes.
And all of a sudden you're quoting it verbatim. That's the Holy Spirit speaking to you, folks. That's intimacy with God. And when you have intimacy with God, you walk through walls. Nothing can stop you. It's not only the end of fear. It is just, you're just going for it. Live life to the fullest. It'll ignite your life. What can I say?
Let me also say that some of the resources, again, most all of our listeners, I'm sure, have a cell phone, so you actually have an app that you can download, and that's a resource that you can find there as well. And a lot of the tools, I mentioned the book, the Bible study, you have all sorts of resources. So the bottom line is, if you say, well, I don't feel real adequate here, you have provided enough tools, so it's really almost plug and play, isn't it?
It is, because we don't train. There's no training required. We just allow you with scriptures to back you up, knowing that you don't just do it. What's the old phrase? Just do it. Just start loving on people. Determine this moment, folks. If you want to have the time of your life for the rest of your life, just start right now saying, God, from here forward, I'm going to move everybody every day closer to Jesus just by loving on them. Letting people know I'm a Christian, perhaps by saying something non-offensive like, oh, that must break God's heart, or that you want to put a smile on God's face, or boy, God saved your bacon on that one. There's fun ways to mention about God. That lets them know you're a Christian. And then they open up. Everybody is anxious, wondering, where is God? Where are you right now? Because of Charlie Kirk in particular, the world has come to the point where it's never been easier to love on people. They're desperate. Think about it. We have the greatest product in the world, and we have the whole world that's desperate for it. And we're going to sit quiet? God help us. and we're missing out on all the fun, and knowing that we're making a difference for eternity. You think of the only thing you can do today for eternity is get people into heaven. And when you get to heaven, the only question going to be asked once you're in heaven is how many other people are in heaven because of your influence.
Good question.
You have influence, folks. Everybody, street people have influence. You have influence. The question is, what are you doing with your influence? Are you using it to bring glory to yourself, or are you using it to bring everybody you know, everybody you're with, even this person who meets casually on the street, closer to Jesus? And then you're living for his purpose. Understand, living for his purpose. Forget your purpose. I built a whole business for nothing to the number one global brand. You know how I did it? By living for his purpose. I used my business for his purpose. My focus, my enthusiasm, are living for his purpose. And then, oh, by the way, he just built this huge company behind me, and he opened up doors. I could go on all day, tell you the miracles he did. Why did he do that? Because I was living for his purpose. And when we do that, he makes everything good.
Very good. Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back. We'll continue with Barry Meguiar. Let me just mention, too, maybe you have a comment or a question about evangelism. I'd love to give you a chance to join the conversation or ask a question. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back. We'll talk about some of these very helpful resources that will get you off the bench and in the game. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Barry Meguiar. Again, if you would like to know more, you can go to igniteamerica.com. And Barry, let's, if we can, talk about some of these resources, because some people hearing this right now might say, well, okay, I'm motivated, or I feel guilty, or I would like to do that, but I don't know what my next step is. And, of course, I mentioned a couple of things that they could find. First of all, of course, your Ignite Your Life book. You have your Ignite Your Life Bible study. You also have Live Ignited, a 12-month devotional. You have a social media guide from scroll to soul. So help us out. If somebody says, okay, I want to get involved, what are some resources we could put in their hands that they could get available, and then see how they could seek and save the lost?
Well, they're all there. That scroll to soul is a wonderful thing, because, I'm convinced, I really am, that Gen Zers are the only hope for America. I preach the same message, share this message with groups of 1,000, 2,000 people, and 10 people come up afterwards broken and wanting to get in on it. I do it with Gen Zers. They're not on their phones. They're all listening. And they come afterwards, they said, you mean God is the source of truth? You mean I can actually have meaning in my life? I can make a difference? Gen Zers, yes. Thank God for your hunger for the truth, and being tired, as we all are, of the hypocrisy and the money and the failures and the emphasis on all the wrong things. The only thing that matters is how many people can we get into heaven between now until we see him face to face, and we're running out of time. That's why we have to move everybody every day closer to Jesus. So Ignite America doesn't ask for money. You can't give us money. There's no sign-ins. It's just full out and give you every kind of opportunity. There's TV shows. There's every kind of thing, but they're all just to inspire you, and it's not training, understand. Our book, Ignite Your Life, is, yes, it's 50 years of doing it, but it's the scriptures that point the clarity. This is what life is all about. When he said, when they asked him, what's the most important thing, what did he say? He said, love me and love your neighbor as yourself. If you really love God and you love your neighbor as yourself, you can consider their salvation as important as yours. And that changes your life. That changes everything. You're not indulging. You're not using those languages and not doing that. You're doing everything you can to get everybody around you closer to Jesus. That's oneness with God. It's unbelievable when you know that you're living right the life that God wants you to live, and he's opening up conversations everywhere you go. I mean, it's just, and in the process, folks, it's not like I'm a space cadet. I've done this for 50 years. I've taken Meguiar's from zero market share. We're doing $600,000, literally, buffing cars in body shops. And God inspired me to go retail. And I said to him, I don't know anything about retail. I don't know how to do that, God. So I tell you what, I'm going to trust you with my whole heart, because I don't have any understanding. I don't have a clue what I'm doing. And I've done that. And then I started to leave to go into ministry, because I was sharing so often, having so much success. And I prayed the most fervent prayer of my life. I said, God, I think you want me to go to full-time ministry. If you do, you almost have to speak to me with an audible voice. And not 20 minutes later, a layman came into my office that I'd never met before, only knew him from church at a distance. He asked me how it's going. I started telling him my faith sharing experience. He looks at me and he says, God's given you a wonderful ministry here, hasn't he? I said, what? I mean, they overlap, but now he's telling me my business is my ministry. I said, well, what do you mean by that? He says, a pastor can't reach the people you're reaching, but as a businessman, you can. Yes. And in 1976, folks, 1976, he said to me, it's obvious that your business is your pulpit. wow. From then on, I realized I'm shining for Jesus. I'm shining cars, but it's only the hell I'll be shining for Jesus. Folks, this is what God's called us to do. Love conquers all. Perfect love casts out fear. When you have perfect love for God and for those around you, He casts out fear. He directs your steps. He hears and answers your prayer. He gives you joy every day. That parable of the fig tree where He says, when you bear fruit, my joy remain with you and your joy remain full. I'm 83 years old. I haven't had the time of my life, folks. I'm living proof that the Scriptures work. I mean, Karen and I are having so much fun. We keep saying every day is an adventure. And we're so thankful to God. And we just want to share that joy, that fun. It's not my story. It's nothing unique to me. I'm just doing the very simple things that God told us to do. That's why He called us a Great Commission, right? It's so much fun. Folks, you got to get it on. Join us, would you please? Right now, when Americans are being called to confront with God and our roots, it's a moment in time where we have their attention. Right now, right this very moment. Don't miss it. Don't miss this opportunity to talk to America and to everybody that's around you when this is uppermost in their mind already. They're starving. That you have the information they're starving for.
Got a great opportunity.
I'm convinced that the opposite of opposite of Christian love is not hate, it's apathy. We just don't care, folks. We got to start caring and loving them like we love ourselves.
The key
you
talk about,
American revival.
one of the things you talk about is the idea of love on everyone. You know, you talk about starts with prayer, love on everyone, be generous, always be ready. Yes. It does seem to me that sometimes it doesn't require more than just making a statement or showing some kind of love to open the door. Because a lot of people, Barry, say, well, I don't know how to get from a conversation about the weather or sports to the gospel, but just loving on people sometimes opens the door instantaneously, doesn't it?
It's so easy, folks. You'll be amazed how easy it is. Stop worrying trying to ask certain questions or say this. Just love on them and let them know you're a Christian in some non-confrontational way. And they will always, always, always open up to you. And God will always give you the words to say. It'll be a spiritual moment. Many of you have never had one time like that. You can have it several times, 4 or 5 times a day, every day. It's incredible. And let me add one quick thing, one more website. You asked, speakinggod.org. We have cards you can get for us free of charge. Go to igniteamerica.com and order these. We'll send you a packet of them free of charge. We have thousands of Christians all over America reordering and using these. At the end of those 5-minute conversations saying, sound like you'd like to know more about God. And they always say yes. And so you say, I have a website for you that would just blow you away. It'll tell you how much God loves you, has a plan for your life.
Very good.
It'll actually lead them from zero to the sinner's prayer. It's called seekinggod.org. And by the way, for those of you listening to us right now, there's a lot of you who've not made that decision. If you'll go to seekinggod.org, it'll answer every question. And literally, without Kerby or myself or a pastor, in the quiet of your own home, the Holy Spirit speaks to you through that website and through His Word and His Scriptures, and He'll bring you into a saving knowledge. He'll ignite your life, and He'll take that fear.
Very good. Well, again, let me give that one more time because we're just about out of time. Seekinggod.org, and you can watch a little video there. Of course, we have a link to igniteamerica.com. Of course, we have links to all of those other resources. And Barry, I appreciate the fact that, of course, people can hear you on a lot of radio stations. Of course, they can read your book. They can follow your social media resources, the app, and all the rest. And so thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Greatly honored. Thank you, Kerby. God bless.
Going to take a break. When we come back in the next hour, we're going to get into some issues in the news. But just again, Barry Meguiar, you can find everything you need right there on the website. We have a link to his website if you click on that. If you scroll down in just a few minutes when we come back from the break, we, of course, have some information about Trump in China. We also have our Pray for America. Normally, we encourage you to sign up, but even if you have not signed up, it is our first article up there today, which has our suggestions on what you might want to consider, how you could pray, and then how you could act. And so that is the Pray for America Today Trump's summit in China. We'll have some more to say about that and a variety of other issues, but as you probably have noticed, we've focused a lot of time and attention on the church this first hour. We'll come back and talk about what's going on in our culture right after these important messages.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's see if we can talk about what's going on in China right now. Certainly you're going to see some things in the press. I would point you to the fact that we have posted today our Pray for America. Most of the time we encourage you to sign up for it, and if you have not signed up for the Pray for America newsletter that we send out once a week, it is something that Liberty McCarter puts together and really encourages you to pray for America or pray for our situation that we might have. We certainly would encourage you to sign up. But today, Karen took the time to post the one on Trump's summit in China. It gives you an overview of kind of some of the issues that we should be praying about. And I would encourage you, as you read through that, if you have not signed up for our Pray for America newsletter, or actually it's an email alert that goes out once a week, we would encourage you to do so. Now, when you look at China, I've said sometimes politics, and China certainly fits in this category. It's like the ultimate Rorschach ink blot test. You know what those are? Those where they show you an ink blot and then you say, what does it look like to you? And it, in many cases, shows how people project themselves on an image. And that is very true right now in the political sphere, and probably best illustrated by the way in which the mainstream press and then the alternative press has covered this trip to China. First of all, I yesterday posted a piece, and we posted it again for you to see. It comes from our good friend Gordon Chang, in which he pointed out that if you looked at a lot of the legacy press, the word of the week was the word weak, W-E-A-K, weak. In other words, that the president comes headed to China in a very weak situation where Xi Jinping has all sorts of leverage against Donald Trump. I also uses a quote from The Economist. The former editor said that Donald Trump is in a weaker position. But if you were to watch some of the other programs, and last night I tended to watch Fox because I wanted to see what I guess is going to be an interview tonight that Sean Hannity does with the president. Last night, Sean Hannity did an interview as they were flying over on Air Force One with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Many of the commentators are talking about how Donald Trump is in such a strong position. So it illustrates again, I guess you see what you expect to see. If you do not like like Donald Trump, you hope that he's in a weak position. You say he's in a weak position and say that Xi Jinping has all sorts of leverage over us. If, on the other hand, you recognize that, as I point out in a commentary that will come out next week, based upon some of the things that Victor Davis Hanson points out, there have been a fair number of successes. And right now, China finds themselves in a difficulty even being able to get gasoline. They have been dependent upon Venezuela. Remember what happened there? 60% of the oil that China gets to produce all sorts of products, from gasoline to diesel to kerosene and the rest, comes from the Strait of Hormuz. If you notice where that is right now. And so certainly you're going to have Xi Jinping act in an aggressive way, and I'll mention that in just a minute. But I think it illustrates again that certainly that is the way he deals with certain individuals. As a matter of fact, in this piece by Gordon Chang, he quotes from an individual at a think tank that said, when foreign leaders visit Beijing, they're viewed not as peers, but as the modern equivalents of tribal chieftains arriving to pay tribute. And so you had some of the bluster that comes from Xi Jinping, but I think he also recognizes that they really don't have too many cards in their hand right now. And when you get into issues of artificial intelligence, certainly fentanyl, Taiwan, human rights abuses, there's quite a bit that Donald Trump can say. But that being said, at the same time, Xi Jinping is not going to look like he is weak. So one of the early statements we had from him was that these two countries, China and the United States, could risk some kind of danger if there are clashes or even conflicts over the issue of Taiwan. And the statement read, the U.S. side must exercise extreme caution in handling the Taiwan question. The argument, if it is handled properly, the bilateral relationship will enjoy overall stability. Otherwise, the two countries will have clashes, even conflicts, putting the entire relationship in great jeopardy. And so, again, that was some of the readout there. Again, you have the Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirming that Taiwan is still an issue, and U.S. policy, he said, on the issue of Taiwan is unchanged as of today. Now, the concern, though, is some of the people in Taiwan and other places have wondered whether or not the United States, under Donald Trump, may, in order to have better trade deals and more bilateral cooperation, we might, in some respects, back down from that. And there is no indication I can see that Donald Trump or Marco Rubio are planning to do that. But nevertheless, the United States has recognized that they don't want to necessarily force a change. And if nothing else, the stand of the United States has been pretty much consistent across multiple presidential administrations, he said. So with that as background, let's also recognize that there are some other issues to address. And of course, one of those was the issue of artificial intelligence. Another, if you're going to talk about who has the cards right now, this did surface in some of the conversation yesterday, even with the mainstream press. And that is, China is more export dependent than it's ever been in the recent past. What do I mean by that? China needs to sell things. China makes things, and then it exports those, and that is the source of income to their economy because, of course, they have to spend a fair amount of money to, of course, just even afford the oil, which, by the way, is not making its way to China right now because of some of the problems in the Strait of Hormuz. So, again, this has become a real issue because even though it makes all these things, it doesn't really have a what you might call a consumer-driven economy. Well, the United States does have a consumer-driven economy, but you need to be able to manufacture those and sell those. And then, of course, that brings us to one other issue. tariffs. You can imagine that in addition to talking about the T that is Taiwan, there will also be conversations about some of the other T's, trade and tariffs. And so in some respects, these are some very important sticking points between China and the United States. And recognize that what is there for public consumption is important, but not half as important of what is happening behind the scenes. We've seen this before, going all the way back to John Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, to Reykjavik when you had Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev gathering together, and is probably happening right now as well behind the scenes. Some kind of negotiations, some kind of deals, and we'll see where that takes us. And I think it was really striking when you think of the fact that not only was standing with Donald Trump, Secretary of War, Secretary of State, but again, Tim Cook, president of Apple, and Larry Fink of BlackRock. Very interesting summit. We'll continue to watch it, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been talking about a financial realignment of the global financial system, which he calls Bretton Woods 2.0, but should probably be described as Bretton Woods 3.0. Here are the three eras of the U.S. economy. Bretton Woods is the agreement established in 1944. The U.S. dollar became the reserve currency, and the agreement also created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The dollar was pegged to gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. That lasted until 1971, when Richard Nixon closed the gold window. Bretton Woods 2.0 was never officially negotiated, but emerged because of an agreement with Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars and recycle the proceeds into U.S. treasuries. This was the era of the petrodollar and lasted about 50 years. But now we see many countries selling oil in Chinese yuan and other currencies. Bretton Woods 1.0 was the dollar on gold. Bretton Woods 2.0 was the dollar on oil. Bretton Woods 3.0 is the dollar on stablecoins. People in other countries with unstable currencies would like to have their finances in dollars rather than their local fiat currency. Stablecoins are backed by U.S. treasuries, which helps the government fund its national debt. With that as background, perhaps you can see why Congress already passed the Genius Act, which regulates stablecoins, and why the Senate now seems poised to pass the Clarity Act, which provides a regulatory framework for stablecoins and other digital assets. I believe we are moving into a new era of finance, which the administration believes will help us to continue to fund the growing national debt. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's we can talk about socialism and capitalism. And I've got two very good pieces, one by Noah Rothman, one by John Stossel, which we'll get to. But this is something we have been very concerned about for some time, because the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that socialism is better than capitalism. So 7 years ago, we produced this little booklet on capitalism and socialism, which primarily sort of looked at what are some of the arguments people people use against capitalism, and what are the answers to that? A few years later, it occurred to me that probably what I should also do is deal with the issue of socialism by itself. So this little booklet I'm holding up right now dealt with some of the obvious arguments against socialism. And those two were, I think, two great resources that we've had available for some time. But then in light of all the things that have been happening and the individuals that have been elected to office, I thought we need to do another booklet on socialism, but we really already have two on that. And then it occurred to me, I know, let's, if we can, talk about one of the best books to critique socialism written by Friedrich Hayek, which is entitled The Road to Serfdom. And I'll hold this one up. And so again, I recognize very few of you would ever read that book, but this is sort of like the Cliff Notes version of that, so that you can see that when you get to this issue of capitalism and socialism, we really want to provide you with resources, especially if you know young people that buy into this. I might just, as a program note, mention that there's going to be a future Outlook magazine on this as well. So there are lots of ways in which we've tried to address it. But let me, if I can, also point you to the first article here by Noah Rothman, which has the rather interesting title, "The Democratic Socialists Need a New Model." And the reason I bring it up is that if you look at especially the one that I've done on socialism, when you start talking about socialism, oftentimes you can say to young people, well, really, why would you want socialism? Because look at Venezuela. And immediately they move from, well, Venezuela's not a good example. A different kind of socialism would be to find a socialist country like in Norway or Sweden. And so, again, in that piece, I even talk about the fact that Sweden really isn't even a socialist country anymore, based upon some of the comments that come, interestingly enough, from the historian Andres Hagström. But interestingly enough, this piece that comes from Noah Rothman is the same way, because he says the capitalist enterprise is alive and well, even if that is in what is supposed to be the paragon of socialism, Sweden. Today, one of the reporters says nearly half of the primary health care clinics are privately owned, many by private equity firms. 1 in 3 public schools are privately run, up for 20%. School operators are listed on the stock exchange. If you look at Sweden a little bit more, even more impressive, when Sweden has done better economically, what have they done with it? They've been able to shrink the size and scope of the state. I wish we had that in this country right now. Stockholm, Sweden has lowered its overall tax burden, reduced its health care and welfare expenditures, created incentives for private sector actors and charities to take on what used to be government mandates. So when you go back, it gives you some quotes from Bernie Sanders talking about socialism in Sweden. It's not that anymore. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, talks about we need to be importing the Swedish model. Actually, she doesn't know what she's asking for. And that even has a quote from Senator Elizabeth Warren when she ran for president, even at the time in which you had the Swedish prime minister saying, no, her protectionist impulses are not reassuring from a European perspective. And the bottom line is that, yes, there was a time when the Social Democratic Party was in power in Sweden, and Sweden was probably an example of a socialist economy. And as my booklet points out, it was an unmitigated disaster. And as a result, that's why many people fled Sweden who had any kind of wealth. Now, this article from Noah Rothman says today the wealthy are flocking back to Sweden and they're taking their capital with them. As a matter of fact, the per capita GDP of Sweden is now the envy of the European Union. There was a time when Sweden, if it had been a state, would have been the 51st state. But it's done a little bit better since then. So that's the first part. The other part of this is John Stossel, who actually does videos and then does a column based upon this. This column is basically capitalism, the thing that works. And he starts out by quoting from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who says capitalism is the absolute pursuit of profit at all human, environmental, and social cost. It's not a redeemable system. He says, give me a break. And he recognizes there's times when capitalism can be ugly. Matter of fact, tomorrow we're going to talk about, on our Friday weekend edition, some very concerning issues of corporate capitalism or crony capitalism. So we'll get to that tomorrow. But he also points out nothing else works. Nothing else makes life better for most people other than that. And then quotes from Steve Forbes of Forbes magazine, who says capitalism is moral precisely because success comes from meeting the needs and wants of others. Higher standard of living comes from trading, buying, and selling with one another. Everyone gets something from a transaction. John Stossel puts it this way: you get a double thank you. You get a thank you from the buyer and a thank you from the seller. Because in a free market, where there's no coercion and there's no monopoly or all the things that kind of make a problem with a free market, if indeed you have a true free market, then the only way people will buy your good or service is if you make it attractive to them. And they are then going to make a voluntary transaction, be willing to pay for that particular good and service, which they value as more than the money that they have in their hands. That's what capitalism is all about. And so, again, he then spends a fair amount of time quoting from some of the people that are actually being, if you will, the proselytizers of socialism in some of these new markets. For example, there's a YouTube channel called Secular Talk. I am familiar with it, in which the particular host says Jeff Bezos, his wealth is making a lot of people poor because we have a finite amount of money. Well, here is one of the things we talk about in both of these books, both on capitalism and on socialism, this idea that there's a fixed pie. Now, I recognize there sometimes is a fixed pie. If we, over in our breakout room, have a pie, and there's a certain amount for each person, and I take a piece larger than I'm supposed to take, well, then obviously I'm in a zero-sum game hurting someone else. But that's not what it is. Sports is a zero-sum game. My success is based upon your failure. My hockey team beats your hockey team. We win, you lose. Okay, got that. But there's not a finite amount of money. If anything, there is a growing pie, not a fixed pie that happens. And over thousands of years, he says, we have had a very significant growth in the overall global productivity, whereas in the past, only the nobility had money and the poor were kept out. But under capitalism, we went from a fixed pie to an expanding pie. And again, she makes the argument we talked about yesterday in why does AOC think billionaires can't exist? Well, she says, no one ever makes $1 billion. You take $1 billion. This is all based upon a fixed pie model, which is not accurate. Amazon's founder grew simply because he was able to invent ways for us to shop more efficiently and pay less. He didn't put a gun to anybody's head to do that, and he actually pays, I think, very good wages to individuals and provides health care and the rest. Then, of course, John Stossel gives you some other quotes. A wonderful story of the woman I did not know who founded Pepperidge Farm. Some great quotes from Thomas Sowell, but basically ends with this statement: only capitalism allows the experiments that create better lives. And if nothing else, just a reminder that we don't live in a world of a fixed pie. We have an expanding pie. If we are able to encourage you and give you an entrepreneurial opportunity in a free market, you can invent a better mousetrap, as they like to say. You can invent the next great idea, and you can become wealthy from that as well. That's what freedom in a free market allows. That's what freedom in the political sphere allows. We need more of that, and that's why, again, Anybody that believes that socialism is better than capitalism hasn't looked at the, if you will, testimony of history. And we do, in our book on socialism, remind you of all those failed socialist experiments. We're about to see a few more in some of the cities in America. But let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just, if I can, point you to another article, and this one's by Byron York, The Democratic Fantasy World. And in case you were thinking he's a little too harsh, I might just point you to the fact that yesterday we had a piece which was entitled Senator John Fetterman Bashes Conspiracies, in which, as a fellow Democrat, was concerned that his Democratic Party was made up of a lot of people that believe conspiracies that are not true. Well, in some respects, Byron York took this issue on and gives us some other numbers which are even more concerning. I mean, if you listen to what we talked about yesterday, about the fact that you had a significant number of people who self-identify as Democrat, who actually believe that one or more of the assassination attempts against Donald Trump are actually staged. It's interesting, Byron York dug in a little bit further, and what before was concerning is really concerning. And by the way, it isn't just Democrats. Republicans at a smaller level do as well. But let's get into it, because he breaks some of this down in a way that I really had not perceived how bad it was. And thus, let's again give credit to Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, who is a Democrat, criticizing his fellow Democrats about believing in conspiracies, one of which, of course, has to do with whether or not there was an assassination attempt at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Senator Fetterman says, I was at the table. This is not a staged event. I can assure you that it was not. But Byron York is an individual that, of course, writes oftentimes for a number of different resources, but probably is best known as the political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, says a new poll suggests that a sizable number of Democrats, more than 40% in some cases, believe the attempts on President Donald Trump's life were fake. Now, the survey, I'm going to go into it in a little more detail. I don't want to get too much into the weeds here. But it's a survey of 1,000 Americans over the age of 18. It's done by NewsGuard and YouGov. It's a very credible poll, in which they make three statements. Do you agree with any of these? The assassination attempt against Donald Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner on April 26 was staged. Number two, the assassination attempt against Donald Trump at a Trump presidential campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania in July 2024 was staged. Number three, the assassination attempt against Donald Trump at Trump International Golf Club in September 2024 was staged. Now, do you agree with that? This is amazing. I mean, I'm just off the charts. First of all, pollsters found that 34% of Democrats said the one at the White House Correspondents' Dinner was staged. That's a third. 42% of Democrats, that's almost half, said the Butler shooting was staged. And 26% said the Trump golf club incident was staged. Just to be fair, by contrast, 13% of the Republicans said the White House Correspondents' Dinner was staged, 7% of Republicans for the Butler shooting, 7% for the Trump golf club. And again, as he said, as bad as the Republican numbers are, reflecting an information system and troubled culture in which fewer and fewer people believe what they read and watch, but he says, here's the real issue. The Democratic numbers are off the scale, reflecting something far beyond that, a political atmosphere in which some people will believe anything about their hated opponent, that he is a fascist, a dictator, a man who would stage an elaborate, phony assassination attempt for political gain. He says one of the most striking parts of the finding was that the seemingly it's almost impossible to deny what happened, as he points out, in Butler, Pennsylvania, because, of course, we're talking about one that was on the news July 2024, and yet you have all sorts of Democrats arguing that Trump was not shot, but that this was, I guess, some kind of fake blood that he put to his ear. But you've got to put this in perspective. Not only was Donald Trump shot and visibly bleeding, but one man was killed and two others were seriously wounded. And yet, interestingly enough, all of it captured on video. We had a funeral for one individual, two people go to the hospital, in addition, of course, to President Trump going to the hospital. And you have now most Democrats don't accept, almost most of the Democrats don't accept that it happened. And here's something else that I had missed. And this is where, again, kudos to Byron York, because he says the poll questions gave respondents the opportunity of saying they were not sure whether these assassination attempts were staged or not. So think about this. If you add to it, they were staged or I'm not sure, this gets the percentages even higher, and it's just even hard to get my head around this, because he says when you combine the number of people who said that a particular event was definitely staged with those who said they were not sure whether or not it was staged, you get a majority of Americans who question the reality of the Trump assassination attempts. Let's put those numbers together. For the Butler shooting, now 53% say it was staged or they were not sure. For the Correspondents' Dinner, 56% said it was staged or they were not sure. And even for the Palm Beach golf course incident, 52% said it was staged or they were not sure. And as you have already picked up, these figures were, of course, dominated by the Democratic respondents. Now, just think about this. If you can't get something as straightforward as that, as being something that most Americans would agree to, you can begin to see what we're dealing with, because now you're talking about huge numbers. Let's put it in perspective. Millions and millions of Americans who believe the assassination attempts are massive lies, or at least they might be lies. And he then says, now we perhaps can get a better perspective on some of these other incidents that have happened. And I'll just use one since we only have a few minutes before the next break. And that is, do you believe that Russia tampered with the vote tallies in order to get Donald Trump elected president? And that's, of course, to be in 2016. And first of all, that was something that was asked in the YouGov poll many years ago. And first of all, the statement is clearly false. There's never been any evidence that Russia tampered with any of the vote tallies. None at all. I mean, the argument sometimes been, well, what about the dossier or something like that? But no evidence, even people that don't like Donald Trump, have ever argued that Russia tampered with the vote tallies in the 2016 presidential election. But nevertheless, and this is, again, a YouGov poll, 31% of Democrats told pollsters the statement was definitely true, and another 36% said it was probably true, which means 67%, or two-thirds of all Democrats, actually believed that Russia may or did tamper with the vote tallies in the 2016 election. That is just off the charts, but it illustrates again some of the kinds of problems, the kind of fantasies, and the kind of conspiracies that a very significant voting bloc, millions and millions of voters who are going to go to the polls right now in the primaries, go to the polls in the general election in November, who actually, for example, don't believe that these assassination attempts were real, but do believe that Russia actually tampered with the vote tallies in the 2016 election. And once you add to that all the other fantasies and conspiracies, you've got to be concerned about the future of this country. Because we oftentimes laugh about the fact that when you go out into the various areas in the country and even ask young people if they can name the three branches of government or name even one of the chief justices of the Supreme Court or even the current justice of the Supreme Court or who the vice president is, they can't come up with any answers. And we all jokingly say, and then these people vote. They don't know anything about the government. But now it's gotten even worse. We recognize the fantasy world that so many of these voters live in, and yet they're casting their vote on who will be the next member of Congress, who will be the next senator, eventually who will be the next president of the United States. And this, I think, is deeply troubling. So if you wanted to really dig into the survey and recognize that we do have people living in a fantasy land, this piece by Byron York is more than just a little bit concerning, and it's on our website at pointofview.net. Well, enough heavy stuff. Maybe we'll get into something a little more light in the next segment. And so we'll take a break and then hear from an individual I've enjoyed over the years, Bob Greene. He's been a writer for the Chicago Trib, from TV dinners to smartphones. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Last article is from TV Dinners to Smartphones, written by Bob Greene. If you're not familiar, Bob Greene has been a very well-known columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Before that, he worked for the Chicago Sun-Times. Best known for some of his books in which he's done biographies. I remember he did the first one with Alice Cooper, actually traveled around with the rock musician Alice Cooper, and then later did a couple others on some presidents. His best-selling book was on Michael Jordan, since he lived in Chicago, Hang Time, Days and Dreams with Michael Jordan, and as an individual that certainly was writing about a lot of fun issues. Matter of fact, this particular article reminds us of his latest book, Chevrolet Summers, Dairy Queen Nights. But he's talking about how, in some respects, we were paving the way for screen addiction with TV dinners. Now, if I had a group in front of me right now, I'd ask, how many of you remember eating TV dinners as you grow up? And the older you are, the more likely you are to raise your hand, although we were talking off air about the fact that if you go to Lazy Dog, you can get TV dinners there. So, again, even the younger generation might. But TVs and televisions developed in the 1940s and early 1950s. And what would happen is the family would be at the supper table. We called it the supper table. Remember this? And then after you would eat, you would then go into the den and you'd watch television. And two things changed that. The first is by the 1950s, we had newspaper advertisements for what were called TV trays or TV tray tables. And these were these metal trays with tubular legs. And the idea was that you could set that up there and then have your meal on that, maybe even gathering around the dining room table, or you could go to where the TV was located. And the TV trays were generic, but then they got to be trademarked because the second part of that is a company out of Nebraska known as Swanson. Remember the Swanson TV dinners? Well, sure. And these began then to put together what were frozen meals in heat and serve aluminum trays. Usually had 3 compartments. And in many cases, they weren't the most edible, but they were okay. And he points out the fact that you would serve big and hearty slices of moist, tender Swanson turkey with giblet gravy, special cornbread dressing, fluffy sweet potatoes or just white potatoes, sometimes some garden fresh peas. And so you could get fried chicken, you get pot roast, you could get Swiss steak. Before long, they even figured out how to add a 4th compartment, and that was for dessert, and that's where you got the apple crisp. For some of you, I'm bringing back memories. For some of you younger listeners are going, can you believe these people were eating out of aluminum trays? Well, yes, they were. And the bottom line is that kind of began a process which Bob Greene suggests is carried on to this day. Because, and I may put this in a future book or article or something like that, 10 million TV dinners were sold in 1954. And that's when you had kind of the peak of the baby boom. You know, from 1946 to 1964, you had just an enormous number of babies, 76 million, if I remember right, babies born into the world. And as a result, this was a boon for mothers and also for kids that were there, because then you, of course, had the, as he says, the seductive power of the screens, because now families wouldn't always eat in the dining room. They would actually then have an opportunity to go and watch TV. Meanwhile, of course, the Swanson Company even took out ads. Watch your favorite TV shows and serve a turkey dinner, too. The ads featured this home economist named Sue Swanson, who I think was a made-up person. I think there was a Betty Crocker, but I'm not sure there was a real Sue Swanson, but I could be wrong on that. And this was a way in which you could then get some of the TV dinners, and this would be a way in which you could just sit in front of the TV and indeed watch your favorite TV program while you're eating your TV dinner. And he points out that the TV dinner was an early, if unintended, step towards our current world where people can't look away from their screens because we have now not have the big screens, we have the small screens, we hold them in our hands. And I've talked many times about the number of times each day the typical American will look at his or her smartphone, a cell phone in that regard. But nevertheless, back then, even when the TV trays were actually unfolding, you had one of the columnists with the Los Angeles Mirror-News say, most of us spend too much time watching TV anyway. Why ruin our stomachs as well as our dispositions? Mealtime used to offer us an excuse for getting away from the darn thing. But he, of course, Hal Humphrey, who wrote that, had no idea what was about ready to unfold. And as somebody who has kind of watched that unfold, I used to have an MP3 player long before we had phones. So I began to understand how people might be drawn to look at their phone. I used to jokingly say, and this goes back decades ago, since I had an MP3, sometimes if I was in a line, I didn't mind sitting in lines because I would watch something while I was standing in line. And I began to realize once the iPhone unfolded and we had the different cell phones unfolded, we have the situation today where entirely too many people have screen addiction. But nevertheless, Bob Greene, in his delightful way, reminds us that before we had smartphones, we had TV dinners, and we couldn't necessarily even watch TV by itself we had to have a TV dinner in front of us so we could watch what was on the TV. Of course, once the TVs could move, that wasn't quite as important, but it illustrates again some of the change of the technology and how it has affected us even to this very day. Let's take a break, though. Tomorrow we're going to be getting into some very important issues, not the least of which, of course, is as we talk about this idea of re-engage 2026. Going to talk about the fact that the president has suggested on Friday night to all the way to Saturday that could be a national Sabbath or Shabbat. We're going to be talking with a guest about that. I think you're going to appreciate some of those conversations as well. But let me also point you real quickly to the interview we did last hour with first George Barna, the spiritual progress and regress of Gen Z. That's available on the website at pointofview.net. We also have the information and focus that we had with Barry Meguiar on Ignite America. As you go there, you'll see that we've also posted my commentary today on Bretton Woods 3.0, which I will probably get into maybe more next week because we won't have even time tomorrow with our roundtable guest. But as you go there, we'll also see one more time we're making available, as we'd like to do, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It is something we've packaged together, and if you'd like to receive it as a download, well, of course, we'll need your email. But I hope some of you would just say, yeah, I'd like to get a booklet in the mail. Just give us your address, and all you have to do is go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says Get Your Free Booklet Today, and we will be glad to send it to you. All sorts of great material available to you today on the website, including some of these great pieces of material on capitalism, socialism, even this democratic fantasy land, and of course one from TV dinners to smartphones, all available at the website, pointofview.net. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. If you find yourself wanting to hear any more on some of the topics we've addressed, click on that button that says watch or listen, or maybe even send it to someone else that needs to know a little bit more about it. It's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Tomorrow, looking forward to a roundtable discussion right here on Point of View. We'll see you then.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.